Great. Good morning and welcome to the U.S. Public Interest Research Group webinar on this year's Following the Money report. My name is Ben Davis. I'm a policy analyst with Frontier Group. I'm joined by Phineas Baxendall, Senior Tax and Budget Analyst with U.S. PIRG Education Fund. As many of you know, every year we release Following the Money, our annual report that assesses transparency websites in all states. This presentation will first review our approach to evaluating transparency and then go over our criteria in the Following the Money 2014 report. At the end, there will be a Q&A. Feel free to message in questions at that time using the chat feature in the GoToWebinar toolbar. Or if you have a microphone set up, feel free to raise your digital hand in the toolbar, and we can give you the digital microphone. And just so you know, we will post this screencast online in the next day or two. With that, I would like to turn it over to Phineas.
Well, thank you, Ben. Can you all hear me there? Ben, can you hear me all right?
Phineas, I can hear you just fine.
That's great. Ben and the Frontier Group have been working with U.S. PIRG from the earliest of our national transparency reports, and we're very glad to have him here, and we also appreciate your participation in this webinar. We look forward to working with you all this year as we send out our initial feedback about what we've been able to inventory on your state site and asking for your stories about cost savings, the obstacles you face, and the innovations that you're working on. Before we talk about this year's Following the Money report specific, I wanted to say a few words just about the U.S. Public Interest Research Group Education Fund. The U.S. PIRG Education Fund is the educational affiliate of the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, a network of organizations that is 40 years old and includes state-based affiliates in 27 states and hundreds of thousands of citizen members, as well as a student PIRG affiliate that works with students in over 100 campuses across the country. We're a nonprofit and nonpartisan group that advocates and provides public education on a variety of policy-related issues. As you can see from the next slide, I'm going to talk about our approach to evaluating transparency. This before Ben gets into specifics of the criteria, and I'm going to talk about the value that transparency can provide and how we've come to think about the changes that we're going to be making this year. I'll be covering why we think online transparency is important, the value we strive to bring in creating this annual scorecard, why we update the scoring criteria each year, how we select which state transparency portals to score, some of the obstacles that we face in making these 50-state comparisons, and some lessons that we've learned since last year that inform our updated criteria. Now, moving to the value of transparency, we believe that transparency is important for a variety of reasons. Open information about the use of the public purse is crucial for democracy to ensure that public resources are allocated in a way that matches public values. Our report details the many ways that online transparency can improve the effectiveness of spending and save money, generating more bids and more competitive bids, identifying opportunities for lower cost contracts, reducing costly information requests, etc., and improving procurement goals such as contracting with vendors in ways that can be based on in-state contracting, minority or women-owned businesses, vendors employing people with disabilities, etc. Transparency also encourages the public to be more engaged and to have greater confidence that public dollars are open to scrutiny. As a result of that active and potential scrutiny, transparency also checks corruption and abuse of spending. There's an example when we talked to New York City comptroller about their transparency site. They talked to us about a huge overage of turned out to be $100 million plus IT system that had originally been contracted at much lower, and they didn't realize it for quite a long time. And they now have a system where very high up in their site, you're able to see the 10 most over budget contracts, and you're able to see actual outlays separate from contracted outlays. And features which make it easy to address this particular kind of potential abuse or overages issue. But moving on to the value of the scorecard that we produce each year. We've produced this annual national scorecard each year because we think it helps to promote greater transparency through access to online spending data. Having a scorecard helps to spread best practices and demonstrates progress that happens over time. It helps motivate improvement and makes it possible for non-experts to understand comparisons between the states. Lastly, it allows for potential identification of patterns to see if certain states or government characteristics correspond to more or less developed transparency. Now, one question that I know I've been asked, as some of the folks who are joining this seminar have asked me, is why we update this criteria each year. It would probably be easier for everybody, certainly us, if we kept the same criteria each year. But each year we update our transparency criteria because our goal is to help the cutting edge of transparency become the new standard. What the public expects from transparency is constantly on the rise, and the ability of technology to provide transparency is constantly improving. Over time, we want to place less emphasis on standards that have become so universally practiced that they're no longer the cutting edge. 15 years ago, it might have made sense for us, if we were doing this report, to recognize when states were making their sites viewable by multiple browsers, for instance. And that's an issue which is just not really pressing now. We wouldn't want to spend a lot of attention on it still. Lastly, as I'll discuss, we want to learn each year in our process to improve our own scoring and evaluation process. So moving to which websites we actually evaluate. In the next slide here, how do we choose each state's representative for this spending transparency? Firstly, we choose online information because in this day and age, that's how people seek information about their government and how it spends. Transparency means online. Second, we think of these websites as transparency portals. That is, citizens shouldn't need to know beforehand what it is they're necessarily looking for, and they shouldn't need to have a collection of separate web addresses where they know how to find different types of information in different places. We evaluate based on what can reasonably be reached through a single portal. We seek to evaluate the best scoring site also in each state. So if there's more than one transparency site, we will score them separately and then choose the highest scoring one to include in the report. We want to help you put your state's best foot forward. Moving to the next slide is the obstacles that are faced in making these trying to make sound comparisons. There are trade-offs that we face in updating this evaluation criteria each year. The first is that we need to have standardized protocols that yield completely objective decisions for which any visitor would arrive at the same kind of conclusions and the same score looking at that same website. The easiest way to do this is with very simple rules applied completely uniformly. On the other hand, we recognize that there can be alternative ways to achieve the same kinds of functionality. We don't want to dictate certain kinds of menus or vendor formats, for instance. We also want to be flexible enough to recognize when a state has found another, perhaps superior way to make information open and accessible. We sometimes make tweaks in our protocol to be able to recognize these kinds of unanticipated issues. And it's why, frankly, we need to reserve some right to make those adjustments. It's a reason why we hadn't done a webinar like this before, is that we really want to avoid a situation where we tell you anything that ends up not being true. Other obstacles to our mission that we face is in considering how the public and the media will interpret our findings. We're evaluating the level of a state's online spending transparency. We recognize that your offices face different kinds of hurdles in terms of the resources, the technology, the jurisdictional issues, and even what the law tells you you're allowed to do. We try to point out those hurdles in the report, and we ask your assistance in telling us about them. But we wouldn't have a meaningful scorecard if each state's score sought to reflect the obstacles and at the same time how good a job the responsible office was doing despite those obstacles. We know it can feel like we're evaluating your office and your job performance, and that sometimes you can take the brunt of this, but ultimately we're ranking the state and not your office. Moving to the last of these 6 issues, which is what we learned since last year in a nutshell. Last year was a real banner year in that it was the first time that all 50 states had checkbook level contracting data. This was fantastic to see, and all of you folks on the phone should be congratulated for your part in that. It does inform us also that less of our scoring emphasis should be placed on that universally achieved feature. One thing that we have heard is that our report provides a really valuable service in shining a light in off-budget types of spending that wouldn't ordinarily receive public scrutiny or the normal checks and balances of the annual appropriations process. So we're trying to deepen our look at those kinds of transparency. Ben will talk more about the specifics of that. Based also on the potential misunderstandings by the media, when a state's score goes down merely as a result of the updated standards, we really want to make sure this year that we are being as clear as we can at pointing out where the functionality of a site itself has not been downgraded and may have even increased incrementally despite the reduced numerical score. And lastly, we realize that our focus on the information that is on state websites can miss out on a consideration of the information that might be missing from those sites. We'd like to recognize where states are being open about what kinds of data are not included, as well as what kinds of data specifically are included. We want to recognize that also, all else equal, it is better to have more departments, more types of spending included for within the larger universe of potential data to include in these sites. So that concludes the background, and I want to hand this back over to Ben Davis at the Frontier Group to talk about the specific criteria in Following the Money 2014.
Great, thanks, Phineas. So, as Phineas said, I want to spend some time speaking about what exactly the criteria will be for next year's report. I'm always pleasantly surprised to see all the updates made to transparency websites. In the couple of weeks after we send out our initial assessment, usually in January, and by sharing the criteria with you a couple months beforehand, we hope to jumpstart any changes you would like to make to your state's transparency website. So this year there are 4 main criteria, and they are contracts, quasi-public agencies, economic development subsidies, and tax expenditure reports. I'm going to go through these and their sub-criteria one by one. So for contracts, there are 4 sub-criteria: checkbook level, searchability, completeness, and bulk downloadable. First is checkbook level spending. What we're looking for is a database or a list of individual payments made to individual vendors, just how your personal checkbook would look. So you would see the name of the company receiving the payment and the amount paid. And then the best practice is also, just like a checkbook, is to include the date of the payment, though in our criteria, the month or the year is all right too. Every state, as Phineas said, has an online checkbook. That was something we achieved last year. So I think most people joining this call are familiar with this and know what this is. In order to receive full credit, the payments made to vendors must be in a list or database. Systems where users must open up the actual contract to see how much money is paid will not receive full credit. And the reason being is that having the spending data as a list or in a database is just more user-friendly. A lot of contracts can be confusing and hard to understand, especially if you are not an expert in the field. and we want this information to be accessible to every resident. Searchability. This criteria is the same as last year, so users should be able to use a search interface to sort through various payments made to vendors and pull up a specific list of payments. In order to receive full credit, the checkbook must be searchable by the name of the recipient, by the keyword, and by the purchasing agency. We'll likely award credit again this year for the keyword subcriterion if users are able to search by the fund that the money came from. Users must be able to search for the full vendor's name. So being able to only search by the first or the first and second letter of the vendor's name will not receive full credit. And being able to make searches with Control F or a search tool built into Acrobat or something like that will not receive full credit either. Users should be able to make a search and then see all the results of that search. That being said, whether the checkbook is searchable through a search box or a drop-down list, both are good practices and will receive full credit. If the platform uses search boxes, there should be a separate search box for the vendor's name, a separate search box for the keyword, and a separate search box for the purchasing agency. Completeness. All right, this is a new criterion this year. One of the biggest critiques of state transparency websites is that they only shine a light on a portion of state spending. Though this is the case sometimes, I know that many on this call have worked pretty hard to shine a light on all state spending, regardless of payment size and regardless of purchasing agency or regardless of legislative appropriation. And this completeness is something that we would like to highlight and promote. The one exception here, so we think that all spending information should be available. The one exception here is for confidential information. For example, a payment to a security contractor for clandestine responsibilities. In these instances, by all means, keep confidential information confidential, but it's a far better practice to redact the names of the recipients or redact the names, or redact the details on the project. It's a lot better to do that than to redact the amount of the payment. And in instances when a vendor name is redacted because of confidentiality, it's best to provide the reason for the confidentiality in lieu of the vendor name. So what we're looking for is a statement or a graphic that lays out what is available in the contract checkbook and what is not. We are still figuring out the best way to operationalize this, but one way is to do something that Virginia has done. I'm going to give a quick second for the slide to load. So here you can see that the transparency website data point states that it lists 100% of all state spending through contracts. You can see that at the bottom there, it's a simple statement, shows what proportion of state spending is online. Here is Massachusetts. Here, Massachusetts has provided a graphic on what is available on the website and what is not. And it's great that Massachusetts has taken action to put the clear majority of payments online. There are a few shortcomings with this, though. First, it's currently ambiguous to visitors if payments in the MARS system cover all state agencies or just a select group, or if payments are just for executive agencies, or if they also cover the legislative spending. So fixing this is relatively easy. Second and more fundamental is that the 15% of payments that are not in the checkbook are because they are protected. These payments should ideally be part of the checkbook, but with the vendor names or other proprietary information redacted. Moving on to bulk downloadable, this is the last subcriterion under contracts. In past years, we awarded credit for transparency websites that allow users to download the checkbook data as a CSV, Excel, or other file. Being able to download the checkbook data allows users to identify trends in state spending, such as the proportion of payments awarded to in-state vendors, or it allows users to identify changes in spending on budget items over time. This year, we are expanding the downloadable criterion to include bulk downloads. This is where users can download all checkbook data at once. According to the Sunlight Foundation, one of the national authorities on open data, bulk access to information is often one of the simplest and most direct steps a government entity can take to share information with the public. To receive full credit this year, the list of payments to individual vendors must be downloadable in bulk. The checkbook must be downloadable by complete fiscal year or calendar year. And being able to download the data department by department or vendor by vendor will not receive full credit. Here is an example. This is a screenshot from Louisiana. You can see that all statewide spending data are downloadable for the past several years. So that is the contract's criterion. The second main criterion is quasi-public agencies. These are sometimes called quasis. These agencies are independent government corporations that are created through enabling legislation to perform a particular service or a particular set of public functions. And over time, quasi-public agencies have taken more and more responsibilities away from conventional government offices. The Maine State Housing Authority, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, and the Nebraska Corn Board are examples of quasi-public agencies. Because quasi-public agencies typically collect fees or other forms of their own revenue, they do not rely solely or even significantly on an annual appropriation from the legislature. And as a result, these expenditures often fall outside the official state budget and are difficult to scrutinize without strong transparency. For these reasons, it is especially important that the contract payments made to quasi-public agencies are included in the checkbook tool. So that is the quasi-public agencies criterion. Let's move on to economic development subsidies. There are 4 sub-criterion: awards to companies, downloadable, intended public benefits, and actual public benefits. So state and local governments allocate an estimated $50 billion each year to private entities in the form of economic development subsidies. These incentives, which can take the form of grants, loans, tax credits, tax exemptions, are awarded with the intent to create jobs and spur economic growth, yet some of these expenditures and their outcomes are not fully disclosed. Disclosing subsidy payments is especially important because the awards are often granted without a formal procurement process, so payment information will often take place in the dark. To receive full credit this year, transparency websites must post the individual subsidy payments awarded to individual companies in a list or database. Specifically, we're looking for subsidy payments awarded to recipients through the 5 largest subsidy programs in each state. Good Jobs First, a national nonpartisan organization that has compiled the largest database of state subsidy awards, will be coming out with a list of the largest subsidy programs in each state, and we intend to use this list for this criterion. If a state has only 3 or 4 large subsidy programs, we won't dock points, but we'll likely weight the other programs more heavily. If a transparency website does not post subsidy information itself, but rather provides an obvious link to the economic development website that contains the database or list of subsidy payments, we will award credit for that as we have in past years. Downloadable subsidy information. So similar to how states' contract data should be downloadable, the list of subsidy recipients and subsidy amounts and other subsidy information should also be downloadable. Similarly, we will be assessing if the 5 largest subsidy programs in each state fulfill this criterion. Intended public benefits. So these subsidies are awarded with the explicit goal of growing the economy, and to make sure that the economic growth delivered by companies is worth the tax dollars, citizens should be able to monitor that the specific public benefits intended to be produced by each company, they should just be able to monitor what these benefits are. And whether it is job growth or job training or increases in wages, the intended public benefits should be part of subsidy agreements. And citizens have a right to be able to see the details about this online. The last sub-criterion under economic development subsidies is actual public benefits. When a company receives a subsidy and delivers on the economic growth, such as a specific amount of job creation, it should be reported so decision makers can assess the subsidy programs. That way, resources can be directed towards more successful programs and be directed away from programs or companies that fail to deliver. Ideally, website users should be able to see the number of jobs actually created right next to the number of jobs intended to be created for each subsidy recipient. A related best practice is to post online the instances of development funds recouped from companies that fail to deliver on the agreed upon economic growth. This will be extra credit this year. Here's a screenshot of Indiana's Economic Development Subsidy Checkbook tool. You can see the recipient company, the amount, the program, and you can see some other useful information. I think one of the great aspects of this website is that it allows users to download the data for offline analysis. You can see the Export Contract Details button in the top left of this screenshot. And then if you click on the project ID number in the first column, the website directs you to a page with job growth numbers and other useful information about just that subsidy payment. I think one of the good things about this website is you can download the actual copy of the subsidy contract, which isn't necessary for full credit this year, but it's definitely a great practice. And then here's an example from Arizona. So this is an excerpt from the Commerce Authority's 2012 report on their Arizona Competes Fund. It allows visitors to view the awards given to individual companies. And though it's not on here, one good practice followed by the Arizona Competes Fund is that there is a clawback provision which allows the Commerce Authority to recoup funds if the recipient companies fail to deliver on their promises of economic growth. So we've gone through the contracts, quasi-public agencies, and economic development subsidies criteria. The last criterion is on tax expenditure reports. Those of you familiar with last year's report should be pretty familiar with this criterion. Tax expenditures are subsidies bestowed through the tax code in the form of special tax exemptions, credits, deferments, or preferences. Once created, tax expenditures can escape oversight because they do not often appear as state budget line items, nor do they often require legislative approval to renew. For these reasons, spending through the tax code is in particular need of disclosure. One of the best practices here is to provide a link from the transparency website to the tax expenditure report, which details the state's tax expenditures with the resulting revenue loss from each program. This year, full credit will be awarded for being able to easily download the tax expenditure report from the website and for the tax expenditure information for 5 years being contained in the reports. So that wraps up the grading criteria that will be in Following the Money 2012. The criteria, as Phineas said, could change slightly, but as of right now, this is our intention for next year. The last thing is that Phineas, our affiliates in various states, and I would like to extend ourselves as resources to you in whatever way possible. I know that among those in attendance today, there is a lot of hard work going on. So if there's some way we can help, such as clarifying anything said in this webinar, or discussing these issues with other public officials or journalists in your state, or anything else, please let us know. Thank you. So we, at this point in time, we would like to open it up for questions. So please feel free to message questions in with the chat feature in the toolbar. Or if you have a microphone set up, please raise your digital hand. It's a little yellow icon in the toolbar. And we will give a minute or two to let questions come in.
And I'll just note at this point, this is Phineas Baxendall, that this entire presentation will be posted on the US PIRG website. So if there's something that somebody missed and wanted to hear again or see again, there'll be an opportunity to do that and scroll through this again. Also, at one point or another, we referred to the upcoming 2012 report, and we meant the upcoming 2014 following the money report, of course.
Great. We have a question from Scott Phillips. Which list will be used for determining the largest subsidy programs? Who publishes it?
So Scott, that's a great question. The group Good Jobs First, they've compiled a list of over 250,000 different economic development subsidies and have spent quite a lot of time tracking the list of the five largest economic development subsidy programs in each state. They published a report a few years ago, I believe, which was a similar format, which they are going to revise and release before the end of this year. I don't yet know if they know an exact date, but it is definitely going to happen. And as Ben mentioned, there will be some states where there may not be five significant economic development programs, and in that case, there will be a kind of weighted average of those other significant economic development programs. Thank you for your question.
Brenda Lee, you would like to know if we will distribute the slides from this presentation. As soon as you said we're planning on posting the screencast, we can definitely post the slides too. If people are interested, that should be no problem. We have a question from Elizabeth Hallmark. She is wondering if we could review the timeline for our next report, for our next Following the Money report. Phineas, I can answer this if you'd like.
Go right ahead. Go right ahead.
So, Elizabeth, I'd be happy to send you an email afterwards with more specific dates. I just don't have them right in front of me. But we are intending to release the report in late March or early April in 2014. In about mid-January, we should send you our assessment of the features that are on your website and the features that are not on the website. And we usually give about 2 weeks to get responses back. That usually happens in about mid-January. The report is released in late March or early April, and then we're going to start assessing the websites in early January after the start of the year. Eric is asking, will full credit again require 3 years worth of data? Let me go back to the slide.
While you're going there, Ben, I'm just going to clarify when we say that we'll start assessing in early January, that will be after we've done the initial inventory, website inventory. So that'll be the for making the final assessments.
Right. Right. What I meant to say is that if people on this call are planning to make certain updates on their website, we won't be reviewing websites until early January to give you guys some time. So to answer your question, Eric, this year we will not be. It's not our intention to have one of the criterion be for historical data. It's definitely still a good practice that allows people to track spending over time. But this year, it's not our intention to have that be one of the criteria. Will US PIRG, this is from Scott Phillips, will US PIRG be collecting and reporting on transparency site maintenance and development costs again this year?
Yes. We think it's important. I think there are misconceptions about how expensive this can be. I mean, sometimes it is, particularly for a smaller state, significant, but people can have unrealistic notions of how expensive it can be to do this, and so it's important to be able to show what it actually costs so that states can make clear kind of cost-benefit decisions about whether it's worth a particular level of investment.
Maria Garnett asked, when does the initial website inventory begin? I think, as we just said, it'll begin in early January. Anita Ward, you have your hand raised. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Phil, and never mind, you put your hand down. We're going to give another minute to see if there are any last questions, and then we'll wrap it up. All right. Well, if people do have any questions or anything they'd like to discuss with Phineas or myself, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you guys very much for attending, and we look forward to working with you guys in the next few months.
Yes, thank you.
Great. Thank you.